The trip to the town hall was fairly uneventful, all things considered. The mayor didn't wish to speak to them, so they relayed the information to whoever else was available. As for Mr. Smith's investigation notes, they were nowhere to be found. A shame, really. It could have been nice to get an idea who was behind these brutal murders. After stopping by the tea house for a cup of tea, Mr. Endicott gave the professor a ride home, offering the safety of his salon if so desired. Professor Bardsley was grateful for the offer, but politely refused, deciding he'd rather just stay home today. It had already been a long enough day as it was, and he really just wanted to relax for a while. Hours later, Professor Bardsley found himself engrossed in his library of anthropology books. He had read them all before, some of them several times, but they offered an odd sense of comfort to him. Perhaps, he thought, there would be something useful in his studies to help him determine what was really going on here. People had different ways of coping with stressful situations. Some would cry, wallowing in their sorrows. Some would try to take their minds off of it, try to stay cheerful in spite of everything. And sometimes people would band together as one, working collectively for one purpose, just like what had happened to Mr. Smith earlier today, just like what the Mafias had been doing. He let out a sigh, closing the book he was reading and glancing up at the clock. Goodness, however did it get so late? It seemed he had been at this longer than he thought. Perhaps it was time for a break. He put the book back on the shelf, thinking to check the news for any updates on the murders that had occurred today, only to find out that 2 more people had been murdered. Mr. Stow, the owner of the pub on Stowberry Road, Stowberry Street, and Kieran Chander, one of the students from the college. It seemed people were dying off at an alarming rate. How troublesome. "Man, Cassidy, that's just horrible," said one of Cassidy's college friends, taking a sip of her milkshake. They'd decided to stop by the Burger Hut that night, hoping to relax a bit after all that had happened. Especially poor Cassidy, who had seen the body firsthand. Barely, but still. "I know, right? I mean, who would kill a blind kid at a funeral? It takes a special kind of evil to do something like that, I think." Cassidy nibbled at a French fry, not feeling terribly hungry after what had happened that morning, but figuring she should at least try to eat something. "I just feel like, I don't know, I wish we could do something about it. Find out who's responsible and stop them." "And how would we do that?" another friend asked, taking a bite of his burger. "I don't know. I just hate knowing that these people are still out there." Cassidy was fidgeting in her seat by now, getting really worked up about the whole ordeal. "These people had killed a poor blind kid, and they probably killed Enna, too, and now who knows when they're going to strike again." As if on cue, Cheryl Roxanne Lewis appeared on the Burger Hut's TV with another live report. There had been more murders, Mr. Stow and Kieran Chander. They were both dead. And not just one Mafia had struck this time, but both Mafias. "Kieran Chander, don't we know them from school?" someone asked. Yeah, and Mr. Stow from the pub," someone else muttered, horrified. That pub had always been a great hangout place to go and get drunk once finals were over, and now the owner was dead, and Kieran was dead, too. Cassidy just stared at the screen glumly. With these 2 deaths, that meant there were 5 dead now, all within the span of 2 days. And 4 of them all happened in the same day to boot. The whole thing was escalating at an alarming rate. "If we do something," Cassidy remarked, "we need to do it fast." Professor Bardsley shut off the television as soon as the report ended, pondering over these 2 new deaths. 2 almost simultaneous hits, by 2 separate Mafias. It was almost as if the 2 of them were working together. But was that really the case, or was it just coincidence? Surely the 2 Mafias were rivals. It seemed unusual, but perhaps it was the case. It wasn't entirely out of the question, after all. He was about to go back to his library to study one of his books again more carefully, when suddenly he heard commotion from outside. His abode on Boulder Point Street was close to the main square, which allowed him to hear when the mob of townspeople were at it again. He glanced out his front window to see that they were dragging the cake baker, kicking and screaming, out into the middle of town square. The cake baker? Surely they couldn't be serious. He hastily threw on his coat, rushing outside to see what was going on. Perhaps, he thought, he could put a stop to this before more innocent blood was shed. By the time he had gotten outside, however, Lindsay Lucas had been forced to her knees, one of the Burger Hut employees holding a cake knife to her throat. Upon closer inspection, the cake knife had blood on it. Miss Lucas was covered in cake batter, but not in blood. This meant she must have been the one who used the knife. She must have been Mafia. "Take this as a warning! We are coming after you, Chill of the Night and Abominable Iflam! We are fighting back!" Not even the cries of Miss Lucas' twin brother was enough to stop the impromptu execution. The knife was slashed across her throat, and just like that, she was dead. Professor Bardsley could only watch the phenomenon, slowly trying to process what he had just seen. He still found it hard to believe that the cake baker was part of the Mafia, but considering the cake knife, And surely there were other signs he was unaware of. He shook his head, turning and going back into his house. Now, more than ever, he needed to do some research. Cassidy, meanwhile, had found the execution wholly satisfying. After she and the other students had finished their meals at the burger hut, they'd started on their way back to the Pretty Boy dorms, but were stopped when they noticed Lindsay baking up a storm in Everington cakes. The woman always enjoyed baking, but something about the frenzy she was in seemed off. Lindsay must have been shaken by the recent deaths, and was trying to relieve some stress. As they stood there and watched, a crowd started to form. And then it happened. Cassidy was devastated. Since Enna's death, she'd been seriously reflecting on the fun they'd had at the cake shop, how kind the staff there was. Enna's death was tragic, but when they found evidence that Lindsay was in the Mafia, the so-called chill of the night, she felt betrayed. How could Lindsay have done this? And Mr. Stahl, who was reportedly killed by the chill of the night? It infuriated her. How dare you? Cassidy shouted, overcome with emotion. I trusted you. Why would you kill him, Lindsay? One of the other students cried. Stop her, yelled another. There was a struggle, but the townspeople won. They dragged Lindsay out to the town square, shouted a warning to the Mafias, and killed her on the spot. After all the death that had been happening these past 2 days, after how completely sickened she felt, Cassidy had found the execution wholly satisfying. This is promising, she thought to herself. We caught Lindsay red-handed. That means we can catch the rest of the Mafia, too. Filled with renewed confidence, she turned to her friends, smiling for the first time since she'd heard of Enna's death. If Lindsay had all those paper snowflakes, the rest of the chill must have some too, she told them. And if not, Lindsay's can be destroyed, so they'll need to make more. An abominable iPhone probably has a lot of those playing cards, one of her friends pointed out, and cut-up magazines. We just need to find out who's been making them, and stopping the Mafia should be a snap, Cassidy concluded. How hard can that be, right? It was pretty easy to catch Lindsay, someone pointed out. Exactly, Cassidy nodded firmly. So, who's with me? Let's do it! Yeah, we'll show 'em! Professor Bardsley awoke that morning to the sound of classical music. He stirred, regretting having decided to stay up so late, studying those books on the night before school was meant to resume. It certainly didn't help that all the chaos of the past 2 days caused him to almost entirely forget that fact, which led to him doing a lot of his lesson planning last minute. A very unprofessional move on his part, he was sorry to say. Nonetheless, he decided he should do all right after a warm shower and a cup of... Wait, that music wasn't his alarm. That was his ringtone. He blinked, sitting up and immediately being greeted with the cold air outside of his warm bed. That's odd, he thought to himself, starting to get his bearings. Didn't the heater turn on? Finding his glasses and putting them on, a quick glance at his alarm clock confirmed his suspicions. The power was out. How inconvenient. Realizing what this likely meant, he checked his cell phone. Sure enough, there was a message from the staff at Pretty Boy College. Due to the power outage, class for today has been cancelled until further notice. Well then. He sighed, climbing out of bed and proceeding to get dressed. If nothing else, perhaps he'd be able to determine what had caused the outage. Sure enough, it didn't take him long to find the source of the outage, especially made obvious by the crowd gathering at Siren Song Beach. Someone else had turned up dead, which was entirely unsurprising at this point. Apparently, the magician's car had veered off the road due to the work of the Mafia. Presumably, the brake lines had been cut. This was the 6th person dead now. Truly, something had to be done about this string of tragedies. Then again, they had done something about these tragedies. Miss Lucas had been killed, and apparently this had been done in response to that. Was there anything they could do that wouldn't just end in more bloodshed? When the nun spoke of going to the morgue, Professor Bardsley nodded in agreement. Yes, it won't do us any good to stand around in the cold, he spoke. Has anyone from the morgue arrived yet to... A few feet away from the car sat a briefcase, broken open, with its contents fluttering about aimlessly on the wind. Apparently someone else had noticed it at around the same time, the nature photographer, Miss Boudreau, and started collecting the papers as best as she could. Professor Bardsley decided to help with the endeavor, picking up one of the papers in an attempt to see what was written on it. The paper was, of course, wet, so it was difficult to properly read. However, the few words he could see stood out rather clearly. Mafia. Murder. Investigate. These are investigation notes, he realized. This man was investigating the Mafia murders. There was no power. There was no class. These 2 facts were enough to convince Cassidy to venture out of the Pretty Boy dorms and do a little investigating, following up on her decision last night to try and help stop the Mafia. She dragged a few of her friends with her out to the streets of Ifam Cove, bundled up in thick sweaters and coats as they searched for clues. So, what exactly are we looking for anyway? One of her friends asked. I don't know. Suspicious activity, I guess, was Cassidy's reply. Something like Lindsay, maybe. Do you really think something like that will happen again? Someone else asked. Maybe, maybe not, Cassidy shrugged, but it can't hurt to look around, right? It's not like we have anything better to do in this power outage. Deciding she was right, they continued down Main Street in hopes that they would find something unusual. Some others had been wandering around as well, likely due to the power outage, and there seemed to be some rumors of a car accident or something. Just as Cassidy thought they might look into this, she noticed a woman crossing the street with a potted plant in her arms. Where was she going? The morgue? Cassidy blinked. That seemed an unusual place to take a potted plant. Excuse me, Cassidy decided to ask her, is there something going on? We have to collect them! Every piece of paper! We can't let them get destroyed! What if there's something critical on them? Everyone, quick! Grab every paper you see! Professor Bardsley was quick to agree with the suggestion, and immediately started gathering up papers as best as he could. He examined each paper he found carefully, trying to determine if there was any useful information that was still legible. Maybe, just maybe, there would be something within the notes that would help them determine who was behind all these gruesome murders. Attention! Attention, please! He paused at this second voice. It sounded rather remarkably like Mr. Smith's voice, the same Mr. Smith who had been killed just yesterday. He had heard the voice then, too, but that was impossible. Ghosts didn't exist, after all. He just shook his head, continuing to pick up papers while pointedly ignoring whatever else the voice had to say. Surely he was imagining things. Nothing's going on, really. Well, other than these horrible murders, that is. Why do you ask? The murders, of course, Cassidy thought glumly, but that didn't answer her question of why the woman was taking a potted plant to the morgue. However, before she could ask, the woman seemed to notice this. Oh, you mean Barbara T. Manna here? It was just so cold in my shop, I was afraid that she wouldn't make it. Her poor leaves are ready to break off. Cassidy found this a little strange. First off, apparently she had named the plant, which was unusual. Secondly, why would she be taking it to the morgue of all places? Is it, she had to ask, is it warm at the morgue? I think they have a generator, one of her friends pointed out. Oh, yeah, I guess that would make sense, Cassidy admitted. I mean, all those bodies had to be preserved, so they'd need electricity even through power outages. Still, though, she wouldn't normally think to bring a plant to a morgue. But this woman seemed to care about her plant, and if it really was warm. So, are you heading to the morgue? She then asked, snapping Cassidy out of her thoughts. Cassidy was not at all comfortable at the thought of going to the morgue. I mean, especially considering how poorly she'd reacted to seeing Christopher's body, the thought of being around all those dead bodies was rather unsettling. At the same time, it was quite cold out, and a quick glance back at her friends confirmed that they were cold too. One of her friends, Chantel, had a stylish but not really warm coat. Did that girl ever wear any actually functional clothing? And she certainly didn't want to freeze to death, and maybe, just maybe, they could find some useful information there. She swallowed the lump in her throat. Perhaps, for now, she'd have to put her reservations aside. Sure, she replied tentatively. Why not? Her friends seemed surprised at this, gesturing at her as if to silently ask what she was thinking. She shrugged her shoulders in response, giving them a very unconvincing, reassuring smile. She just hoped this was a good idea. You heard it too, didn't you? Someone whispered. She might have been a reporter. The voice of Mr. Smith, I mean. Professor Bardsley paused again. Not only had he thought he'd heard the voice of a dead man, but now someone else had, too. The exact same dead man, at the exact same time. But that was impossible. Ghosts weren't real. Were they? He was silent for some time, trying to decide how to respond to this. All of these deaths lately have been rather rattling, he eventually concluded. Hearing a dead man's voice at a time like this could be a coping mechanism conjured up by the mind. He nodded, seeming pleased with this explanation. Mr. Smith would always take charge of situations like this. He likely would have been present here were he still alive, and his death was quite sudden. It only makes sense. It didn't explain everything, but Professor Bardsley tried not to dwell on it. He was not ready to accept that ghosts were real. No sooner had he dismissed the idea of ghosts than did Professor Bardsley feel a strange sensation poking at his shoulder. It was almost as though someone were trying to tap him on the shoulder, but they weren't entirely there. He just stood there silently, keeping a smile plastered on his face as he desperately tried to ignore it. That certainly wasn't a ghost trying to tap him on the shoulder. Ghosts weren't real, after all. Excuse me, Mr. Anthropologist teacher, your services are needed, came the voice again, Mr. Smith's voice. Being one of the only people here with some sort of specialty and authority here, I ask that you investigate the area. Perhaps you can find some clues. If you find anything, please come visit Town Hall with your findings. He didn't even turn to look, frozen on the spot. as he desperately tried to reason away what had just happened. He was just imagining things. Ghosts weren't real. Clearly he was hallucinating. Was he going mad? No, he had to keep it together. It was just the stress. Everything would be fine. He just had to stay calm. Well then, he said awkwardly, clearing his throat. Perhaps there are some clues to be found here. I may as well take a look, Hallucination or not, it was a good idea, he decided.